Hello, and welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is Dr. Joe Pierre. Dr. Joe Pierre, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. You just wrote a great book, and we've got a lot to talk about. But first, as I always say, I shall give you a proper introduction. Dr. Pierre is a health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco, and he is the unit chief of the Langley Porter Psychiatric Hospital Adult Inpatient Unit. He has extensive clinical experience working with individuals with psychotic disorders, substance use disorders, and those with dual diagnosis. Dr. Pierre serves as an expert witness and consultant in legal cases involving schizophrenia, the intersection of psychosis and religion, delusion-like beliefs and conspiracy theories, and the side effects of antipsychotic therapy. He has authored over 100 papers, abstracts, and book chapters, and has been featured in numerous articles, media interviews, and the award-winning documentary Behind the Curve. His new book, False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True, is available right now. All right. Thanks again so much for being here. That's quite the bio, I must say. And that's the short version. So there's a lot to discuss just in the subtitle, right? But first, your academic work on schizophrenia, psychosis, delusion-like beliefs, where does this book fit in relative to your other work? Why this book for the public now?
Well, so I am a psychiatrist, and in my clinical work through the years, my work has really focused on the treatment with psychotic disorders, as you mentioned, like schizophrenia. But my academic interest has always been in what I call the gray area between clear-cut mental illness or psychopathology and normal behavior. And so although clinically I deal with people who have delusions, which are these fixed false beliefs that might include things like believing that somebody has magical powers or is the second coming of Christ, or has a radio transmitter implanted in their ear that the CIA is using to monitor them. I mean, that's what I tend to see in my clinical practice, but I'm just as interested in why people have false beliefs about other more mundane things and false beliefs that are not representative of mental illness and psychopathology. And psychiatry, by definition, because it's a medical specialty, really focuses on psychopathology. It doesn't spend so much time thinking about why so-called normal people do what they do or think what they think. And I felt there really wasn't a book that addressed that. And one of the most common questions I get from people these days is, why does so-and-so believe, something going on in the world or politically or that kind of thing? And so my book is really an attempt to answer that.
Before we get to specifics from the book, you just mentioned your experience with schizophrenia, psychosis, and delusion, which is separate from, I guess it's the term so-called normal false beliefs. I don't know what else to say. Is that okay?
Yeah.
People can hold very firm yet incorrect beliefs. I'll mention a few. You don't have to respond to any specifically, but people can think that the earth is flat, right? Firm belief. Or COVID-19, it wasn't the result of a virus, but it was caused by 5G. Or that Wi-Fi causes cancers, or that vaccines cause more harm than good. People can hold those very firmly, but they're not mentally ill, correct?
Well, oftentimes they're not. I think, you always have to look on a case-by-case basis. But some of my academic work has focused on the answer to that exact question. How do you differentiate? Because on the surface, there are beliefs that we have that are false, and there are beliefs that we have that are pretty fixed, pretty entrenched. And I just said that was the definition of delusion. So then, does that mean that everyone's delusional? And I try to make it very clear that I don't think that everyone is delusional, although you hear that all the time, right? That we're living in a time of mass delusion or mass psychosis. I don't think that's what's going on. So the way I instruct particularly clinicians to differentiate is with a couple of the following different criteria. When we talk about clinical delusions, like the examples I gave of thinking I might have magical powers, or I have a radio transmitter implanted in my ear, those are beliefs about myself. So I call that self-referentiality, the belief it refers to myself. Whereas the examples that you gave, sort of conspiracy theories, are generally beliefs about the world. that JFK wasn't killed by a lone gunman, or Princess Diana didn't just die in a random car accident. So those aren't beliefs about the believer, they're beliefs about the world. And I think that is a crucial element when we talk about to what degree a belief can be shared. Because generally speaking, part of how we define delusions is they're idiosyncratic. They're not beliefs that are shared by other people. And so what I often say by way of example is that it would be pretty easy for me to find many, many people on the planet who might believe that there will be a second coming of Christ, right? That there will be a Messiah. But how many people could I get to share that belief if I said that I was the second coming of Christ, right? That would probably drop way down. Or another example would be, I think lots of people, probably including myself, think that there is surveillance going on, in the world. There's cameras everywhere these days, right? Our phones are listening to what we say and using that to, inform our Facebook feeds and that kind of thing. But if I told you that, again, I had a radio transmitter implanted in my ear and the CIA was specifically monitoring me, that would be a much harder sell. So that idiosyncrasy of the belief and the self-referentiality of the belief, I think, help guide us. And the third component I'll mention is just the rationale for why we have those kinds of beliefs. And when I'm trying to evaluate someone clinically to determine is this a delusion or not, one of the first questions I'll ask after I understand what the belief is I'll say, well, why do you believe this? And in the clinical setting, when somebody is saying something like, I'm the second coming of Christ, a typical answer would be that they believe that because of some subjective internal experience unique to them. So maybe last night I had a dream and God came to me in a dream and he told me that I was the new Messiah. In fact, I'm hearing his voice now telling me this, right? So that's this subjective sort of protected inner experience. But when we talk about conspiracy theory beliefs around again, let's say the assassination of JFK, typically the rationale is, oh, well, I watched that movie by Oliver Stone, or I've read this book that does a deep dive, or I got online and I found some internet sites that say. So the evidence is out there in the world, and that's not what the concept of delusion is designed to address. So as I like to say, just because you believe something that someone tells you that's false and you happen to think that it's true, that's not what delusion's all about, right? Delusions are about this idea that there's something awry with our inner experience that gives rise to these unusual or false beliefs.
With that in mind, false beliefs, delusions, I thought a great section of your book was, and you can tell me if these are delusions or false beliefs, but some false beliefs we might have about ourselves, such as maybe they're useful, like people think we're better than average or I'm better than average. We often have this illusion of self-control or control over fate, like it'll never happen to me or it'll all work out. I guess that also falls under optimism bias, right? I'll also lump in naive realism, that I see the world as it really is. So are those helpful, harmful, or is it just the way we evolved?
Well, probably both, right? They evolve because they have some evolutionary advantage. So those belong to a class of false beliefs that psychologists call positive illusions. So we don't call them delusions quite, because they don't rise to that level of intensity, and we call them positive because they've been shown to be associated with actual mental health. And so when we tell ourselves things like, the future is going to be great, or I'm better than the average person, that sort of buoys us up. And now what I talk about in the book, though, is that it's kind of a Goldilocks kind of phenomenon where it's not, there's limits to how healthy that could be, right? It's healthy and helpful for me to say that I'm a smart person and maybe I'm better than the average person. But it's not very healthy to say, well, I'm the smartest person in town, and I'm going to lord that over all the people I meet and let them know, right? So there's sort of like the happy medium of like just enough of these positive illusions. On the flip side of that, when we talk about that gray area between mental health and normalcy, there are also lots of people who go around telling themselves the opposite, right? That I'm not a good person. I'm not a smart person. I'm not a good-looking person. And those things can indeed be associated with things like anxiety disorders or depressive disorders.
Another part of your book I liked, because I like to say when I have these conversations, we're all susceptible, right? It doesn't matter how smart you are, how many degrees you are. You could be susceptible to some false beliefs. So can you kind of talk about how expertise can lead to both overconfidence and underconfidence and also lead to false beliefs?
Right. Well, first, I want to agree with you, and I think that's a major point that I try to make in the book. Again, one of the most common questions I get is, why does so and so believe this thing that seems so patently false? But we never tend to ask that question about ourselves, right? When we talk about false belief, there's often this idea that there's these other people out there, our ideological opposites or our political opposites, that are the ones that are misinformed. And sometimes that's true, don't get me wrong. I think there are certainly some beliefs that now have a political influence that are false. But I think we do need to recognize that it is indeed this shared vulnerability, that we all might have personal traits that might make us vulnerable to false beliefs, but also that we could easily find ourselves in social circumstances that might predispose to false beliefs. Now you have to remind me what the actual question you asked was.
How can expertise lead to both over and underconfidence?
Right. So this refers to what I think has become a kind of household name, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Which a lot of people misunderstand what that means, and it's usually used in a kind of pejorative sense to mean that people who are quote unquote stupid are very confident and have exaggerated ideas about whether or not they're right or not. It's not really quite what the research that informed the Dunning-Kruger effect found. What they did find is that most of us do have a gap between our actual measured quantity of knowledge and the confidence that we have in that knowledge. And that gap is largest with people who have relatively less knowledge. So the least knowledgeable among us tend to be the most confident. On the other end of the spectrum, where people are actually very knowledgeable, they often suffer from a kind of imposter effect where they underestimate their confidence or they underestimate their amount of knowledge. So there is this gap along that spectrum. I think the crucial thing to keep in mind when we think about the Dunning-Kruger effect, though, is that when the results are discussed, there's this idea again that there's two classes of people, the smart people and the not smart people, or the well-informed, knowledgeable people and the not knowledgeable people. But there are no two different classes, right? I like to think of myself as relatively knowledgeable in psychiatry, right? I've been in practice for 30 some years, and I went to medical school and residency training, but I couldn't come here and talk to you about Keynesian economics, right? So there are some areas where I am, might consider myself to be very knowledgeable or even an expert. And there's other areas where I would have to concede that I don't know anything about a given topic. And so again, it's not a us and them kind of thing. We all have these areas of relatively greater knowledge, and we all have areas where we have deficits.
And I think that's really important that you point out in your book that does get overlooked with the Dunning-Kruger effect, is that experts even may tend to underestimate their expertise in their own field sometimes, right? Because it can be so compartmentalized that, well, maybe my colleagues could know better or something. So there's the overestimation and the underestimation, which usually gets discounted. Is that part of it? So.
Yeah, exactly. And, in other parts of the book, I do talk about scientists, right? Many scientists might be considered to be experts in a particular field, but what happens on that end of the Dunning-Kruger curve, if you will, is there often is a certain, what I later refer to in the book as intellectual humility. So that even the people who are very expert, and science to a certain degree, this is part of what the philosophy of science is, right? It's the idea that I'm always going to be open to modifying my conclusions based on new data. And throughout the book, I talk about how I think it would be helpful if we thought about beliefs more as probability judgments, meaning, this is something I believe, but maybe I believe it a certain percent based on what I know, rather than we often think of beliefs as all or nothing, right? We have this idea that in society we should have firm beliefs, we should never waver, and we should stand up for what we believe. And sometimes that has value, but I think sometimes we should be more temperate in our belief, and maybe we should even stand down from our beliefs.
We may come back to intellectual humility and scientists, but first, let me ask you I want to ask about the Google delusion, and I'll frame it this way, that we have all the information we need, right, at our fingertips. So first, for anyone that doesn't know, can you tell me what the Google delusion is, and then I have a follow-up question?
Well, so there's this idea, I mean, that term was coined to describe the idea that because we have such easy access to information now, that tends to boost our confidence about what we know. So in the book, I talk about this being like a peripheral brain. And I think we see evidence of this in our daily lives where, I mean, this has happened to me before, I will fully admit, where I might find myself on, let's say, social media, and I'm getting into a debate about something. And, somebody says something interesting and I have to think about it. And what happens is then I go online somewhere and I look up the answer and I say, well, actually, right, because I've just accessed this is not something I knew. It's something I was able to look up in the moment, where 20, 30 years ago we weren't able to do that. So the Google delusion refers to this idea that I must be very, very smart because in theory I have access to all this information. And what research has shown about that is that actually we tend to be more confident because of that access, but similar to what we were saying with the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's not a good reflection of what we actually know. And so we tend to rely on our peripheral brains, on our cell phones, because we know we have that information easily accessible. But our confidence in how intelligent or how knowledgeable we are on the subject is actually very disproportionate. And of course, God forbid we find ourselves in a zone where we don't have cell phone reception, right? And then we can't access those peripheral brains, and then maybe we'll realize just how little we know.
Coming off the ability to search instantly, so that can lead to some of the cognitive biases, right? Like confirmation bias, and we'll find what we want to find. But there can be judicious searches, right? So you can be led to news stories, to science and medical reporting sites, if that's what you're trying to look, or to public health. I mean, if you keep going. So we have the ability to separate fact from fiction with all this. Or am I overconfident in my ability to find accurate sources?
Well, it's a real challenge, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. In my work as a doctor, if I have a question about, what is the right treatment here, or if I'm preparing a lecture for students or trainees on a subject, I tend to be pretty compulsive. And what I'll do is I'll try to get as many articles or as many studies I can on a certain subject. And I'm kind of a little old school and analog. So it ends up being, like a big stack of printed papers. And I read through them and I highlight them. And sometimes what I'll do on in the upper margin, and as I'll write, a plus sign, meaning, well, this study found that this treatment was indeed effective. But then I might have 20 other studies where I have to write a negative because the conclusion was this treatment wasn't effective. So I think when we talk about this concept of like doing our own research, that's really in theory what we should be trying to do, is get, everything, or it's not always possible to get everything, but as much as you can about a given subject. Objectively, and then be able to read through it and then make a conclusion about the totality of that evidence. So confirmation bias, though, is something that we all do that's the exact opposite of that. It's instead of getting all the articles and reading them, it's I have a preconceived notion that I have a hunch, or I have an intuition, or I have a belief that such and such is true. And so then I'll just go collect all the evidence that supports it. And then if I encounter other things that seem to refute it, then that doesn't get included in the pile, and I just cast that aside. And when we're doing that process on the internet, I call it a situation of confirmation bias on steroids, because the algorithms of the internet in places like social media or places like YouTube or like Google searches really do try to steer us to the information that it thinks that we want to see. I think we've all had that experience where maybe we were shopping online for something and now suddenly, all the ads are coming up about that, whatever it is we were shopping for. So you have to be very careful when you're doing your own research on the internet, because you're likely not to get a representative sample of all the information on a given topic. You're likely to get something that steers you more to what you already believe or wish is true.
The research I do, I used to print stuff too, but finally I stopped because I learned how to use a highlighter and annotate online. It's still, and then I write up my own summary. That actually helps a lot. But in the papers you're probably talking about, there's always limitations at the end and a discussion about, well, maybe this does, maybe it doesn't. We don't really know. More research is needed. So when you're doing the Google delusion or a Google search, you're not going to get that summary. So what's a solution to like type in Earth is flat counter evidence? So we should go looking for why we're wrong.
Well, I mean, that is potentially one solution, right? Reasons why the Earth is flat, reasons why the Earth is not flat, and then sort of compare. But I think, I sometimes say that the idea of doing your own research is one of my least favorite terms because it often doesn't really amount to what, for example, a scientist would consider research. Because there may be topics where, there are topics, I think, that all of us lack the knowledge or sometimes the technical expertise to really digest and go through an informational source and decide how accurate it is or is not. And there are lots of things that we believe or lots of facts that are out there in the world for which we have to depend on people who are more knowledgeable and more expert than us. So that's sort of a conundrum about the do your own research. There are people who feel like, there's this kind of famous cartoon, right, where there's a guy on an airplane seemingly in flight, and he suddenly stands up and addresses all the other passengers, and he says, who thinks we shouldn't allow these, snobby expert pilots to run things, and we should let me do it? And, hands go up. So there's this idea that, like, because information and opinion has been democratized, right? We can all do your own research online. We can all post what we believe on social media right alongside the New York Times or, Fox News or whatever, as if expertise isn't needed on a given subject. And so I think that's where it's very difficult when you fall into the trap of doing your own research. There are some things that it's difficult to do. As you say, it's difficult to know what makes a good informational source, what makes a good study. If I'm looking again as a doctor at some treatment, I might need some knowledge of statistical methodology or study design or those kinds of things. And that certainly is not always accessible when we're just searching online. And I think, incidentally, this is particularly a problem right now with AI. What I've noticed just in the past couple months is if you put in something in a Google search or some other search engine, instead of getting the traditional, here's 100 hits that you can then call through, there's at the very top, there's a sort of digested, pre-packaged version of what the answer is. And when I've done that for areas that I'm pretty knowledgeable in, sometimes I'll look and I'll say, well, that's strange. Like, it's saying something that I don't really think is correct. And then if you do the trouble of finding out what that source is, sometimes you find out like, whoa, that source should not be included. And so I think it's important to realize right now what some of the limitations of AI are. AI is really good at gathering information that's out there, but perhaps not as good as deciding what information is more reliable or more true than others. So it can be a garbage in, garbage out phenomenon. And we've seen some examples of that recently where some of the answers provided by AI, like what is 2 + 3? Sometimes, it'll churn out a ridiculously and patently wrong answer.
Let's talk specifically in the book now. You list some core building blocks or pitfalls in our thinking of false belief. You want to list off a few of those that we should look out for, or I'll list them and you can pick your favorite?
Maybe run through the list real quick.
So some that I noticed are the cognitive pitfalls of false belief you list. I already mentioned naive realism, right? Another one is overconfidence. We've talked about confirmation bias, which leads us into motivated reasoning. But some of the other ones like epistemic mistrust, and faith and intuition over analytical thinking, those are big ones. So
that's exactly right. In my book, I try to spell those out, in different chapters and around a different theme. But the reality is there are just so many different reasons why an individual could find themselves having a false belief. I think if we were to highlight some of the most important ones, one we've talked about already, that's confirmation bias, right? The ability or the tendency we all have to discount things that don't support what we want to believe or already believe, and the simultaneous tendency to select information that reinforces what we already believe. Well, motivated reasoning is in the subtitle of the book, so that's very important too. And it's very similar to confirmation bias, but also something a little bit different. Motivated reasoning means that we're not just swiping past information that we don't like. We actually are interacting with the information, we're reading it, we're appraising it, But we tend then to find fault in information that doesn't agree with what we want to believe. And then for the information that we encounter that supports it, we say, well, that's an awesome, reliable source of information. And much of what we know about motivated reasoning these days is often directed by not only what we want to believe, but our ideological identities or our political identities. So we're living at a time where if I know what your political affiliation is, it's actually pretty easy to guess what you believe on these different subjects. And so I think that's a good illustration of motivated reasoning, this idea that we tend to believe what we think we're supposed to believe based on those identities. Another, I think, household word and concept that I talk about in the book is cognitive dissonance, which is this sort of discomfort or tension that we experience when what we do believe butts up against reality, and meaning that we encounter counter evidence. And rather than thinking sort of scientifically, where we might say, maybe I should modify my hypothesis or run another experiment to see where the reality is, when we have that cognitive dissonance, what we often do is we'll just double down on the belief. And say, now I believe it even more strongly now. Or there's so many examples of beliefs about what's going to happen in the future, whether it's something like during the QAnon movement, the idea that Trump was going to declare martial law, right, and that was going to happen in January 20 something. Oops, that didn't happen. So, but wait, this is something I believe, so I'll move the goalposts. Right now, I think it's going to happen in March. Oops, now I think it's going to happen in October. And so that's the process of cognitive dissonance. And you can see that all of these sort of psychological quirks, I like to call them, are really geared towards kind of like what we were talking about earlier with positive illusions. They allow us this luxury of being able to never have to admit that we're wrong and be able to think of ourselves as these very special people who are always right and our beliefs are the true beliefs and everyone else is wrong.
Let's talk about how this can really go bad, okay? Because there can be extremely negative results, right? So you have this section in your book, the flea market of opinion. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, and also when misinformation kills, because it's not always just as simple as, oh, the earth is flat and I can live my life the rest of the way I want to.
Yeah, for sure. So when I talk about the flea market of opinion, we sort of discussed this a little bit just a moment ago. The idea now that we live in this informational ecosystem where there's so many different sources of information. I talk in the book, and I often tell a sort of story of my own life where 40 years ago or 50 years ago when I was a kid, our family subscribed to the local newspaper, the local national newspaper. There were 4 network TV stations, with the rabbit ear antenna on top of the TV that we used for our local news. We trusted these, different anchor people who gave us that news. And if I had an assignment in school, I'd have to hop on my bicycle and ride down to the library to, check out books, which were limited, at the local library. So now, of course, we have so many different sources of information that's not limited to 4 newspapers or 4 news channels or 1 local newspaper or the library. We have literally thousands, if not millions, of sources of information. So that's the idea of the flea market of opinion, right? That's sort of a play on words, that there's the free market of opinion. So there's many different things, and in a free market, you would hope that the best thing rises to the top and outcompetes the lesser sources of information. But it hasn't really evolved like that in terms of our informational landscape. Instead, it's more like a flea market where, because the profits are, when we're talking, for example, on online sources of information, we're not so much paying for subscriptions anymore to newspapers. Now the revenues are generated by ads. And so the monetizing system of the internet is mainly click-based, right? It's like the more we click on something, the more time we spend on a site, the more we're going to be exposed to ads. And that's how social media companies and other online websites often make their money, is through ad revenue. So if we're in that situation, like a flea market, What that means, if it's all about competing for our eyeballs and our clicks, then the loudest, most outrageous, most ridiculous, most flamboyant sources of purveyors of information are going to be the ones that get our attention. And unfortunately, one of the best ways to grab people's attention is to say things that are patently wrong and not true. A sober discussion about confirmation bias isn't nearly as exciting and eye-grabbing as if I said that, Trump beheaded someone today, on the street of New York. That's more likely, even if you don't think it's true, even if you kind of have a sense that that's probably not true, that's probably going to attract your eyes a lot more. So as to the question about, misinformation potentially being lethal, what I say about false beliefs is that they always have the potential to be dangerous. And some of that has to do with less so the belief itself or the content of the belief, but how we believe it. And so, in fact, I'm just now in the middle of preparing a lecture to be given to healthcare providers in hospitals about false beliefs in medicine. So that's sort of one of the most obvious examples of where sometimes false beliefs can kill, right? If we have lost trust in the medical establishment and we don't think that a conventional treatment might be helpful, and then we steer to different sources of information, so-called alternative, interventions. For example, in the area of oncology, of cancer, people who do that, who tend to flock to alternative sources of information, some studies have found anywhere from 2 up to 5 times greater mortality from cancer. So certainly there's instances where false belief can be very troublesome. In my work as a psychiatrist, this sort of stereotypical idea, of course, would be something like the belief that you can fly. Well, that's not going to go well if you try to test that.
And I think this is a good time to reiterate that people aren't stupid or of low intelligence or however you want to say it. Everybody can be susceptible no matter what your education level. And I specifically bring that up because you had a great example of this in your book. And you wrote about 2 of your med students, and you sent them on a quest. You told one of them to do research into 9/11 conspiracy theories, and you told the other one to research the facts and refutation of those 9/11 conspiracy theories. So I think they were pretty well matched students. I know it was just a sample of 2, but what happened there?
Yeah, so I mean, it's such a great illustration of confirmation and motivated reasoning. So just to retell that anecdote, this was many years ago, shortly after 9/11 had happened, and it was probably kind of the beginning of me having greater appreciation of how much misinformation is out there in the world. And I think what happened is that I myself went onto YouTube, and I was very interested in these videos that were claiming that no, it wasn't airplanes, it was the airplanes that shot missiles into the buildings. Or what about building, I think it was 7, did that really fall before, it was announced, or rather it was said that Building 7 had fallen on one of the network television programs, even though it hadn't yet. And so what does that mean? Like, did they know beforehand? So once when I was doing some teaching around these ideas of false belief, I assigned 2 of my students to go onto YouTube, and I told one of them to go and look and see if you can find information to support that 9/11 was an inside job. And I told the other one to say, go and find information where, that counteract that. And so they both brought information, and then we had a kind of mini debate where they said, well, here's the evidence that I have to support this belief. And it was interesting because they knew it was a academic exercise, but they got into it. And I had probably kind of pre-selected them a little bit and who might be more likely to believe one thing or another. But it was just such a fascinating thing. And for me, it underscores what you were saying earlier. This isn't about intelligence. It's not about education. In fact, to a certain degree, the opposite. When we talk about things like motivated reasoning or the ability to analyze a piece of information and decide it's high quality or not, people with higher education are sometimes better at doing that, which means they're actually better, meaning worse, at motivated reasoning, right? They're more likely to get in there and say, oh, this study isn't right, because they actually have that kind of knowledge. So in no way is intelligence really protective of this propensity to fall into false beliefs and to defend them very dogmatically.
Related to that, was something else in your book that I found astounding. I guess I've heard it before, but it's laid out fairly well in your book, is that trust in science. So I have trust in science. Okay. I understand it's a good method for understanding the natural world. It doesn't mean it's always right. It's not, things change, information changes. But you wrote that trust in science can actually open the door to scientific bullshit receptivity. So what is that all about?
Yeah, so that's research from a particular group. I'm blanking on who did that research. I wish I could give them credit. But this is the idea that when we talk about false beliefs around scientific areas of information or knowledge, people who discount what, let's say, scientific consensus is, for example, around climate change, which I do talk about in the book, it's not typically that people say, well, I think science is, hoo-ha, and we shouldn't listen to science. People often do appreciate that science can be very helpful at discerning the truth. And so the surgeon and writer Atul Gawande put this very well when he was giving a commencement speech some years ago. He talked about how mistrust of science isn't really about science, it's about mistrust of scientists. And so to go back to your question, there has been research that's showing that faith in science as a philosophy or as a means of attaining knowledge, is not protective of false belief and can actually sometimes steer us towards so-called pseudoscience, or what you mentioned, scientific bullshit receptivity, information that sounds science-y, and might attract our eyes because of that, but is not actually based on science in any sort of way. And that's why pseudoscience can be so successful. It sort of exploits people's natural, or not natural, but exploits people, the appeal of science that people do have, but then steers them towards very unscientific sources of information or claims.
This seems like a good point in the conversation. And this point in history, we're April 2025. I don't usually date things, but to talk more about confirmation bias and maybe, I wouldn't call it the misuse of science, but maybe where trust in science can lead to some bad results. And this is not a political discussion, but you're going into, you just said you're preparing a lecture for medical, I don't know if you want to call it medical pseudoscience, but medical beliefs that are wrong. And again, it's not political, but we have a pretty disconcerting example looming right now on the horizon because, RFK Jr. is the head of HHS. And, during his confirmation hearings, he has been anti-vaccine and said a lot of bad stuff about vaccines. But when he was directly questioned if he would reassure mothers that, vaccines don't cause autism, he said something like, if the data are there, I'll apologize for any statements that maybe misled people. Okay. The thing is, the data were already there at the time, right? And more appropriately, not only the data are there, that there is no evidence of a link because you're not going to get, anyway, there's no evidence of a link from the data, but he wasn't called on it, right? Study after study, there's no evidence, right? So he suffers from confirmation bias, I think, because he only looks to find a link, right? So that's a great example right now. And also on top of that, he's hired this anti-vax guy, David Geyer, to investigate a link, a non-existent link. But Geyer's one of the authors of some of those poorly done studies that that RFK relies on. So cherry picking, confirmation bias. I already know he's going to find a link, right? There's no doubt about it. So that is an example of misinformation that could kill and potentially has killed already, along with some of the bad treatments he's recommending. So when we get misinformation from what is a well-respected position, about as high as you can get in the medical world, public health, I should say public health of the United States, that's going to have an impact. I'm not sure what the question is there. There's a lot in there. I don't know where you want to go with it. But we're going to have some misinformation coming from the top that could be devastating if we don't turn that around.
Well, I think so. And you asked earlier about, when does misinformation kill? And I said, one of the areas is in, areas relevant to health. And so I do think this is a really, really significant problem. in the book, I talk about, rather than fretting so much about all the different psychological quirks that lead us to false belief, the subtitle of the book is really three different components, which is mistrust, misinformation or disinformation, and motivated reasoning. And so it's a way to kind of understand why people have false beliefs that kind of normalizes that, right? Many people who have false belief, if you ask them, why do you believe that? They'll provide you quote unquote evidence. They'll say, well, here's some source of information that supports what I believe. So if we follow through with your example of a so-called anti-vaxxer, there's plenty of information out there that says, yeah, vaccines cause autism, or mercury. That was the Geyer studies talked about, whether or not thimerosal, which is a mercury derivative that used to be in vaccines and is no longer, whether or not those might cause autism. So those information sources are out there. Now, as a physician, I could counter that and say, well, look, there's been, 10 robust studies looking at hundreds of thousands of people examining this, whether there's association of vaccines and autism, and the answer is unequivocally and definitively no. But then the response is, well, I don't trust those, right? Those studies are done by physicians, and physicians are in bed with big pharma, and they have conflicts of interest. So you mistrust and you discount that huge mountain of evidence, and then you get online and you go, well, wait a minute, there's this thing called the Children's Defense Fund, which was chaired by RFK Jr. for a decade or more. And although they even have their own sort of newsletter or newspaper that you can find online that says, bullet point this, bullet point that, vaccines are terrible, they're worse than the diseases they're designed to represent. So that's the misinformation component. And then the motivated reasoning component is, because I'm now ideologically aligned with the anti-vaccine movement, I'm going to protect that belief, tooth and nail, and then I'm going to attack the counter evidence. And that's kind of where we are now as a society. We don't have the four trusted news anchors where we had this shared sense of reality. Now we have what I sometimes call the tale of two alternate realities, right? I live in this echo chamber or this informational filter bubble where I'm able to justify my belief while I live in this ecosystem, and someone who disagrees with me lives in this one, and meanwhile we just are fighting it out.
You bring up a good point there about combating false information, especially because you're a doctor, so you can point to the studies and say, well, here are 15 studies or 25 studies, and there's no link found. This is only confirmation bias. There are other things spread, right? So vaccines cause autism. I think RFK thinks, I'll just use him because he's a great example. So the vaccines are worse than the disease, and cell phones and Wi-Fi cause cancer, or AIDS isn't caused by a virus, or that there's never been a placebo-controlled study on any vaccine. Not sure where that comes from. Okay, none of that's true, right? But he's at the top spouting this. So ionizing radiation can cause cancer, but not radiation from your cell phone. It's just two different things. Well, two different wavelengths. We won't go into that, right? But if I tell someone that to counter RFK Jr., and they say, well, how do I know that? Okay, well, I have to admit, I don't know that. I mean, I've read a lot of the papers. I can find the wavelengths and whatnot, but I didn't bombard the tissue samples with the radiation and see if it damaged them or not. I didn't run the vaccine trials. I only know how to read a paper, but I trust that they didn't fabricate the data. So should I just keep my mouth shut because I can't really combat it when I'm challenged? I can just point to other things? What do I do?
Well, I mean, you use the word trust. So I often say that we hold beliefs in terms of the reasons why we hold beliefs. Sometimes I'll summarize that as four different reasons. One would be, like you said, naive realism, which is basically seeing is believing, right? Subjective experience. So there's many things that I believe because I experienced them or I witnessed them, right? I believe that I was bitten by a dog when I was 8 years old because that's what I experienced and what I remember happening. So that's one. The second one would be intuition, and you mentioned that word earlier as well. Intuition means this is like, I just have a sense that this is true. Stephen Colbert famously called this truthiness, right? It just feels true to me. A third one, which I think is related, would be faith. Faith I define as a strong commitment to a belief, even though there really isn't evidence to maybe support it one way or another. So it's more of an active decision. I choose to believe that. But then the fourth one that gets around to your question is trust in informational sources, or what I call epistemic trust. There's so many things that we don't know about, and my belief is based on the fact that so and so told me, whether it's the 90 some percent of climate scientists who tell me that anthropogenic climate change is real. I sort of have trust in those people. But the people who disagree with me then would say, well, no, I don't trust the people that you trust. I trust my own people. There was a great article in the MIT Tech Review about how current conspiracy theories around vaccines are rekindling some of the AIDS skepticism that we saw back in the 80s and 80s and 90s, particularly in Africa, where I forget if he was the president or what his political position was, but one of the countries in Africa, he was a sort of notorious person who spread the idea that AIDS wasn't actually caused by the HIV virus, and that likely resulted in tens, or if not hundreds of thousands of deaths in that country. And yet he hosted this conference and he invited some of these more fringe scientists who were alleging that this was true. And so it became again this battle of, well, my scientists say this and the other scientists say this. So who's right? Well, we don't know the truth, and therefore I can believe whatever I want to. And that's sort of the idea of the so-called post-truth world, the idea that there's so many conflicting opinions that truth is unknowable, we'll never know the answer, and therefore whatever I think is just as valid as whatever anyone else thinks. And that, I think, is a very dangerous situation to be in, and it's also, in my opinion, very clearly used as a tool of political propaganda.
You also talk about, so rather than concentrate on who's right and who's wrong, we should examine the evidence together as a group and talk about how we can further test this to find out. Is that something that has to be done on a case-by-case basis? Because it sounds reasonable, but then if someone's really dug in, it's, how, especially you just mentioned the Congo. I'm sorry, I think it was the Congo. I also know there was a person there that said you could cure AIDS if you have sex with virgins. Yeah, that's a great idea. But anyway, so, you can assemble these teams. So how do we agree on a way to test the hypothesis?
Well, I mean, that's what, in theory, or ideally, what we do in science, right? Science isn't about immutable ideas. It's about constantly challenging those ideas, right? The idea of research, if you think about the sort of etymology of that word, it's about research, looking again. So I have a theory. I've collected some data that seems to support the theory, but I'm not going to call that a scientific fact, or I'm not going to say that I believe that with 90% confidence until I've repeated that experiment. And then maybe I've tweaked it in a way that would make me feel more confident. And I think people sometimes get frustrated by science and oftentimes with medicine, because maybe we now have this sort of consensus about you should take an aspirin every day or some such thing. And now 10 years goes by and we say, wait a minute, there's new studies that say that actually maybe that's not right? Like one of the big things that happened recently was a lot of information based on some new studies showing that alcohol use increases your risk of cancer. Whereas all throughout the 80s, we were often heard that drinking moderately, a drink or two per day, was actually better for cardiovascular health and promoted decreased mortality. Now there's this new body of evidence that says, no, actually, that doesn't seem to be true. So I think that, again, the pitfall is to say, well, see, these scientists are always changing their mind. We never get at the truth, and so I don't have to believe anything. And since, if I like to drink, then I just say, well, see, these new studies are BS. I don't have to listen to those. And that, again, I think is where we can really, where we are today is a place that's very dangerous. But so the right way to go about that within people who are doing research, I mean, there is a process. There is a process to have debates or to collaborate on studies or do different studies that change what we believe. But for those of us who aren't involved in that process, it really has become this sort of Wild West where we can just pick and choose what we want to believe to justify our behavior.
All right. There's so much in the book. I mean, we've really barely scratched the surface, but I'm trying to hit some of the high points here. I'll ask two questions, and you can pick one that you want to answer. We've talked, so you list there's like 200 cognitive biases, and we've mentioned quite a few of them. Probably those are in, so if I had to ask you, what top three do you think everybody should be aware of when they're looking at information, their own biases to watch out for? We've probably hit on those, but I don't know if you want to say, are there top three we should talk about? Or, I mean, your top three people should watch out for in themselves, or if you want to tell me about your Holy Trinity of truth detection. Kind of a related question.
Exactly. Yeah, I think answering the latter question helps answer the first question.
Okay.
So it's sort of an irreverent title I've given it, but the Holy Trinity of truth detection, I think, is what we can do as individuals to decrease the chances that we fall into the pitfall, that we avoid the pitfall of false belief. So the Holy Trinity of truth detection is three things. The first is intellectual humility, which simply means that we acknowledge and recognize, accept that we're not 100% right about everything that we believe, right? So intellectual humility is acknowledging that we're probably wrong about some of the things that we believe. The second one is cognitive flexibility, which means that I can consider other views, I can listen with genuine curiosity to what other people tell me, and that if I encounter information that does refute what I believe, rather than engaging in confirmation bias or motivated reasoning and just say, I don't believe that, actually saying, maybe I should be modifying my beliefs about this, right? So that's the cognitive flexibility, the ability to take other perspectives and modify what we believe. And the final one is analytical thinking, which I feel is always misrepresented. Sometimes people use the word critical thinking. And when we hear that, I think it's generally assumed that it means something about being smart or, being able to do calculus or, logic problems. And it's really not about that at all. Analytical thinking, when that term is used in psychology research, really just means slowing down, being a little bit more careful when we encounter information, and rather than immediately saying, ooh, I love this piece of information, or ooh, I'm going to press a button and share it with my friends, I stop and I say, this information could be wrong. And so instead of just accepting it or sharing it with someone or forwarding it to my, friends, let me actually, first of all, read the article. And if the article's about, let's say a new study or something like that, maybe I should go find the study and read that. And then maybe if it seems legit, now I can share it. And that process and what they call cues for accuracy, like if you're kind of primed, that is encouraged from the onset to understand that the information could be wrong and that your goal is to determine if it's right or wrong, that actually decreases the risk of succumbing to false beliefs quite a bit. So that's the Holy Trinity, and they address then kind of the opposites, right? So the opposite to analytical thinking would be intuitive thinking, the Stephen Colbert truthiness. I just believe because it feels good. Intellectual humility, the opposite would be intellectual arrogance, right? No, I'm right. No one else is right. I'm right. And cognitive flexibility, the opposite would be cognitive rigidity, right? That only my perspective counts. I'm not going to listen or consider changing my beliefs, even though someone else might have a difference of opinion.
It's odd when you were talking about analytical thinking. It made me think, in the studio here, we go to reformat a card or something. It says, you sure you want to do that? And then you say yes. And it goes, you really sure you want to do that? And you have to go yes again. So if these social media sites would come up with a button that says, do you know what you're forwarding? And then you say yes. Do you actually understand what you're forwarding? Yes. Have you read it? Just to make people stop and think. We'll never see those buttons. I bet you anything.
Well, what's actually interesting is that those buttons have existed.
Oh, no kidding?
I don't remember what the sites were, but certainly I've encountered very popular, viral posts on social media platforms where right underneath it sort of says a kind of fact check. And similarly, I have seen things where you, for example, click on the retweet or the reshare, whatever, proliferating the information that does say, stop, do you want to read this article before you share? So those do exist actually, but sadly, what we've seen just in the past 6 months is gradually those things, or not so gradually, suddenly those things have actually been stripped away. So Facebook very, very famously now said, you know what, we're going to move away from fact checking and just get rid of that. And certainly on Twitter, now X, we've seen a steering away from those kinds of built-in components that do allow us to do analytical thinking. So sadly, we're actually moving in the opposite direction.
Okay, well, maybe it'll come back. I thought I had a good idea, and there it is all the time. But that's my fault for not being on Twitter or X.
It's a
or whatever.
great idea, yeah.
Okay, Dr. Joe Pierre, your book is False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. Like I said, there's a lot in the book we didn't get to. I try and generate one question from each chapter in a book, but I just start talking, and then here we are. So thank you so much for being here. I hope to run into you in person eventually. And if you can do me a favor as a psychiatrist, can you get inside RFK Jr.'s head? And I just want to I want to know if he really believes this and he thinks he's saving the world, or if he's just a grifter. I can't figure it out.
That's often the million-dollar questions. I'd love to sit down with him and try to figure that out myself.
Well, if it happens, there's another book for you. All right, Dr. Joe Pierre, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.